Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. As we allow folks to enter the Zoom, we do ask that you fill out our Menti poll. If you go to menti.com and use the code 11 32 77 and 5, which is at the top of the screen here, you can answer our first question, and we'll give folks about a minute to answer the question, and then we'll head to our next question. We'll begin the presentation shortly. Thanks again for joining us. If you've just joined, we're asking folks to go to menti.com and use the code 11 32 77 and 5 at the top of the screen here and answer our first Menti question. We're curious how often you use the WRI Open Data Platform Climate Watch. Give you about 30 more seconds to answer this question, and then we'll move on to the next question. Okay, wrapping up this question, it looks like many folks have used ClimateWatch a little bit, and many have also never used the platform. So that is fine. We will be giving an overview of the platform and some of the key modules during today's presentation. So we'll go to the next question here. And what do you most want to see from new national climate commitments? I guess the options are net zero targets, new 2030 targets, implementation policies, and adaptation commitments. For those of you who just joined, again, we are doing some Menti questions here. So if you go to www.menti.com and enter the code at the top of the screen, 11 32 77 5, you can answer our question. And we'll give folks about 30 more seconds, and then we'll begin our presentation. Looks like the majority of folks have answered implementation policies. So very interesting. Thank you so much for participating. We will now wrap up the Menti portion of our presentation and begin the main show here. So bear with us as we switch screens. All right. Well, thank you for joining our webinar today. As many of you know, this December 12th marks the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. On the day of the anniversary, the United Nations, United Kingdom, and others are hosting the Climate Ambition Summit that is seen as a springboard moment. It's an opportunity to signal renewed political and diplomatic focus on tackling climate change while building ambition in the run-up to COP26 in November 2021. During the summit, the Paris Agreement will be celebrated for catalyzing climate action, and countries will be given a platform to profile their new, ambitious climate efforts. In today's webinar, our experts will present the current state of climate action, what to expect going into the Climate Ambition Summit on Saturday, and the lead up to COP26 next year, and resources and tools on Climate Watch to assist policymakers as they ramp up ambition. A few logistical notes. During the presentation, all attendees will be muted. If you have questions throughout the presentation, we encourage you to drop them into the Q&A box, which can be found on the Zoom taskbar. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And at this point, I will now hand the floor over to my colleague, David Waskow, the Director of International Climate Initiative at World Resources Institute, who will provide an overview of the state of climate action. David?
Great, thank you, Matt, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm going to quickly provide some context for the tools that Climate Watch provides. I'll give a sense of the state of play internationally on climate action, and I think the reasons, sort of the underlying reasons that Climate Watch, in fact, is so important to be able to look at what countries are doing and what's happening on climate action in countries. So to begin with, I think it's important to have the Paris Agreement context in mind, where Paris is meant to go, how it's meant to work. As I think probably all of you know, Paris was premised on the idea that it's an iterative process. It was not a one-time deal. It was something that evolving over time in terms of the commitments that countries put forward. Most central to that is the 5-year cycle for increasing ambition under Paris, and we're in the midst of that, of course, right now, as countries look at what they can do and begin to come forward with stronger nationally determined contributions, their NDCs under Paris. It all in place an invitation to countries to come forward with long-term strategies by 2020. And we're now seeing a wave in many ways of countries making commitments to net zero emissions by 2050. Some of those reflected in long-term. But I think as part of the Paris process, we're now seeing an increased attention to and delivery on, or at least pledges zero emissions by mid-century or shortly after. All of that said, even though this process is underway, and next slide, please, we are still not on track globally. I showed how the Paris Agreement is meant to ramp up ambition over time. And here we look at why that's necessary. This figure is from the UNFCCC that came out earlier this week. And the emissions gap refers really to the gap between where emissions are currently headed and where they need to be headed in order to limit warming to or to below 2 degrees. The emissions, the gap here is illustrated by the orange and red bars in this graphic. And what you see is the gap in a couple of different scenarios, one for the 2-degree limit and one for the 1.5-degree limit. But I think in looking at the bars, it's quite clear what the significant gap is that we are facing, the amount of emissions that in fact will need to be reduced even further to hit those targets. You can also see here with the dashed green line on the bottom of the figure where the emissions in fact do need to be 2030 to align with scenarios that limit warming to 1.5. The small orange circle and the small red circle show where we stand with current scenarios with the NDCs that are currently in place. Those that are unconditional, what countries will do they say, in any event, no matter what, and those are conditional on various conditions, particularly finance. Above the orange and red dots, you see the blue dot, and that dot represents where things are currently headed, current policy scenarios. And as you see there, that is at an emissions level higher even than the NDC scenarios, which tells us that even with the NDCs in place, we're currently not even on track to meet those goals, that the emissions level would be higher. So clearly much work to be done. It's why this process of increasing emissions, increasing ambition and coming up with stronger targets is so critically important. Just want to reflect here for a moment on what was said in the Menti responses. I think it was quite clear that many respondents are looking not only for net zero targets, that was the objective of the lowest percentage actually, but also looking for NDC commitments and even more so for implementation policies to actually make good on those various commitments. Next slide, please. And in fact, on this question of implementation, we are lagging also significantly for the most part. I think we're seeing significant headway on many fronts. The prices of renewable energy continue to drop. Battery technologies continue to show price decreases as well. And we're also seeing quite strong increases year over year in sales of electric vehicles, as well as targets for phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles in a growing number of countries. That said, the State of Climate Action report that we wrote together with the Climate Works Foundation and with Climate Action Tracker showed that of the 21 indicators we assessed for various actions in key sectors, only 2 of those actions show a historical rate of change sufficient to meet both 2030 and 2050 targets. And 13 of the indicators show change headed in the right direction, but too slowly. And 2 of them actually show change headed in the wrong direction. So we're clearly not on pace. I think pace is in fact the key question at the moment. Lots of direction, but not moving as quickly as we needed. So those commitments, as I think, implementation policies and commitments to that implementation, as I think the Menti responses showed, is in fact quite critical. Next slide, please. So with that as context, I don't want to paint too dismal a picture because we are seeing quite important movement. We've seen net zero commitments just in the last few months from China, Japan, South Korea. That adds on to commitments from the EU. We also know that under the Biden administration, adopt a net zero commitment, or that is at least the pledge that President-elect Biden has made. So we're seeing lots of movement on many fronts. We also have seen with the UK announcement on its NDC, Colombia's recent announcement, the expected adoption tomorrow, in fact, by the EU of its NDC target, a lot of headway on the 2030 targets, but clearly not enough. And we are looking ahead now, I think, many of us, to COP26 as a key milestone, as a moment by which we need to see not only net zero commitments increased, but also really those 2030 targets come forward to align with those net zero commitments. The road to 2050 goes through 2030. And so we do need to see that with those implementation policies on the ground. The COP was originally meant to be this year, but has been postponed till next year, as you all know. The COVID crisis has shifted much of the attention of governments. Many of them are focusing much more on COVID recovery plans um, uh, in many ways than on their climate policies. But we're also seeing forward movement on NDCs, as I mentioned, and a number of other countries, many small to medium-sized countries moving ahead with NDC submissions as well. A number of NDCs have been delayed to next year, meanwhile, but we are seeing that movement forward. Chile, Rwanda, some island states, LDCs, as in addition to the ones that I mentioned. And there are many that are continuing to plan, the EU, as I mentioned, and others. Next slide, please. That brings us to the summit that is happening in 2 days' time on December 12th. This is the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, as Matt mentioned. It is meant to really be a springboard into next year toward COP26 to give us the kind of momentum and frankly, where momentum may be lacking, to give us the kind of clarity that we need about what needs to happen on the way to COP26. The expectations for the summit, what the organizers, the UK government, that is the presidency of COP26, and the UN Secretary General have asked is for several things. Announcements of updated and more ambitious NDCs, new net zero emissions commitments, adaptation action commitments, and climate finance pledges. They've asked leaders to be the ones to deliver these announcements virtually on the 12th. And we will see shortly, I think later today, in fact, which countries will be taking the stage. I think in looking ahead to the summit, there are a couple of questions, important questions at least, that we need to be thinking about. Will those countries with net zero targets have NDCs? Will countries that have net zero targets also put in place and announce NDCs that put them on track to achieve net zero? In other words, will their NDCs, will their 2030 targets align with that longer term mid-century vision? And also, I think a critical question will be whether finance will come forward. We need that finance in order to spur the kind of action on mitigation and emissions reduction that's needed all around the world, and to provide developing countries, particularly, with the resources needed for that. And we also need it to demonstrate solidarity with those vulnerable countries that are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change already, and will be facing those even more so going forward. So those are some of the critical questions that we'll be looking at on the 12th. There are obviously also many other questions. Who is there with commitments and who is not? Beyond the summit and headed toward COP26, there are other questions as well. What happens next year in the run-up to the COP in terms of additional enhanced NDCs and net zero targets? Will finance and investment be mobilized, as I said, to enable countries to pursue mitigation action across a variety of sectors? That's critical for making headway on those sectoral actions that I mentioned earlier in the State of Climate Action Report. And are we going to see what we call ambition loops? Are we going to see mutually supportive action between and among non-state actors and national governments? Will we see states and cities and businesses coming forward with commitments that then allow national governments to move even further? And will we see national governments putting in place commitments and policies that in turn allow those non-state actors to take the next steps? So we'll be looking at all of that. And I think as we do so, Climate Watch provides an extremely useful tool to be able to look at what is happening on a global scale, where are countries moving and where not, how are they moving, and what does action look like right now in various countries. I'll hand it back over. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, David. If we go to the next slide, we'll now hear from our colleague, We can go to the next slide. And the next one, we'll start by giving some background on Climate Watch, and we will hear from our colleague, Johannes Friedrich, who will provide that. Johannes?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. My name is Johannes Friedrich. I'm leading the overall work for Climate Watch, so we'll give you context of the tool. So before we actually dive deeper and really see what we can watch. The thing to get started with is what is Climate Watch? In a simple way, it is a website. It is an online tool that you can use yourself. It is a hub for hundreds of credible data sets that we have collected for you. And hundreds of thousands of data points. It is there to visualize, analyze that data, and provide quick insights. So for people who haven't used it yet, this is just very short context. Specifically possible, which most of you will have might have used before, to explore greenhouse gas emissions as well as countries' climate targets, which we call commitments on the website. So we're going to show you a little bit what these commitments are, a little bit of the context for them, and then see how you can analyze this. Some of the goals of Climate Watch include to bring really transparency to the space, but it's also to make your work easier, to help everyone like yourself that work on climate change and want to inform and drive climate action, have the information that they need to do their work. It also enables you to get insights exactly for that type of work that you wouldn't have gotten just from, for example, looking at the PDFs that countries submit to the UNFCCC and getting these very quick analysis that's really driven by me, driven by you. Slide. I want to make sure you know that Climate Watch is also a partnership of a lot of organizations that contribute to this, that helps to make it happen. There's great data contributions that make Climate Watch really happen by, for example, the World Bank and BAE and LSE that provided their large NDC data sets. It is not the only data source out there. I want to make sure that you can use it, but we also want to make sure that it has a specific offer and doesn't, you'll find that in the webinar if you ask questions, it doesn't do everything, but it brings specifically together relevant information on greenhouse gas emissions, commitments, and also future-looking pathways for other tools like the Climate Action Tracker, if you want to understand a little bit better in a very quick manner on how ambitious, for example, an overall country's climate target is, that you can always also refer to as a tool, and that are very synergetic to the offer that we have. If you go to next slide, what I also want to make sure you know about is that there are a lot more tools that WI have. Specifically, if you're looking, David was already referring to some of the reports that we have put out and guidance and other analysis. But if you particularly look for data, if you go to wi.org, all of our programs have certain offers. If you look into, if you're interested in a specific sector, for example, or a specific area like Global Forest Watch around forest, Resource Watch around cross-sectoral geospatial data, Energy Access Explorer to map out where energy access investments might be most helpful, aqueduct to map water risks. So please continue to explore this. We think Climate Watch is very useful. There are other sources that might also be able to help you dive a little bit deeper into specific topics. Go to the next slide. And so coming to you, we have really built Climate Watch for you, the users. So we want to make sure that we serve you the best way. There are a lot of users that we have already, which we really see as a success, particular key users for our, who I think many of you are from government ministries representing government, who are either planning or implementing NDCs and coordinating around that. But and many of them is also cite ClimateWatch directly as a data source in the NDCs, which we really see that this can be helpful. Companies, and many of our users are actually the NGOs, medias, and others who actually play an important role, particularly in the transparency and the informing the general public around countries' climate targets and ambitions. We want to make sure, since this is we've built this for you, we want to make sure that this is a two-way communication. So we're constantly improving. This tool will never be serving everything perfectly, but if you have questions, please ask them in the chat. Ask them, put in questions and answers in the Zoom directly, so we can answer those. If you have, you can also provide feedback. So there's also, we're always happy to get feedback, and we're trying to be very responsive to see what we can do and how we can make this tool more useful for you. But then also to mention, we're working a lot over the next 12 months specifically to help you and your organizations better understand ClimateWatch, which is this webinar for, but we also provide customized trainings to organizations right now. So if you feel like your organization will actually benefit and go a little bit deeper into certain topics, or there's specific areas where your organization might really be, could really help to better understand on how to use ClimateWatch or other WI resources, please reach out to us and email us. You can email Matt, whose email will be at the end there, to see if we can provide you, for example, with one of these trainings. And next slide. So this is some examples, because people are always curious on like how others are using ClimateWatch. This is just some quick examples to get you a little bit of an inspiration. We have a variety of users. It does help, for example, multilateral development or private sector investment to inform their investment decisions. It does inform, in many cases, also private sector action to really understand national targets, plan for the future, and see how they can, for example, align their action with national targets. Countries are using it to review and update their NDCs, for example, comparing it with others, as well as planning for implementation and for the future, as well as really looking into transparency and making sure that everyone is informed, both in their own countries as well as internationally, about what their climate targets are. And if you go to the next slide. So this is the last of my slides, and then we'll actually jumping directly into some of the modules that we have and provide you a lot of insights of what you can actually do with ClimateWatch. Just to give you a quick modules that we currently have on ClimateWatch. We are currently busy getting you the latest data on this. So this is one of our key missions as well, to always keep it as current and updated as possible. Give you quick examples. Greenhouse gas emissions module, for example, is the most comprehensive source if you really want to look for greenhouse gas emissions. Not only has it a global greenhouse gas emissions data set that covers all countries and all sectors and all gases globally, and it's going to be updated within the next week to 2018 data. So you really can find the most comprehensive source there. But we also publish data from other data providers, like the Global Carbon Project, that will have CO2 only emissions to 2019 updated in the next week, as well as official UNFCCC data and others. So we're not only trying to say, oh, here's some of the data that we compile, but we also make a lot of the data that our research partners and others are preparing. So this is definitely one of our most used modules. So please go in and explore it yourself. The commitments module is going to be the focus for this webinar, particularly, which is where we track which countries have indicated that they will submit a new or enhanced NDC. We also have a very granular data basis around NDC NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, long-term strategies. We're soon going to launch a net zero tracker. And in each of this, to very much that you go to the website yourself, you can really dive deeper. So while we are going to focus this webinar kind of on a higher level of what you can actually learn from these modules, what are the key insights that we think are important, I really encourage you to go to these tools themselves. And there are, again, hundreds of indicators for the commitments alone that you can map out and then very quickly understand. But there's also hundreds of thousands of data points that you can really dive deep into any single country's NDC, but also compare them, for example, and do some analysis and visualizations yourself that you can download or even embed in your own website. Which is, if you're something interesting to get ClimateWatch your own website, please reach out to us as well. So with that, one of the action items, as well as please, if you have feedback, you can give it to the webinar. There is also a feedback button on the ClimateWatch website that you can use directly, as well as since we are keeping the data so updated, including whenever new NDCs come in, trying to get them on the website on the same day. So you can be sure that if you go on ClimateWatch, it is going to be the latest information and the latest submissions. Please sign up to our newsletter as well, which you can do on the website, which will then provide you always with the latest information, and you don't have to go to ClimateWatch always by yourself and check out if it's actually already updated. Great. So this is a very quick overview. There is other pieces that we're not going to dive too deep into, like the country profiles that give a much broader perspective, including also national policies, vulnerability and adaptation, and other perspectives, NDC SDG linkages, which shows on how much countries' climate targets, the NDC documents actually have some alignments or references to targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, pathways, which is emission projections, and giving you a lot of data there that is published by our research partners, as well as sectoral profiles, which currently cover agriculture. So if you have any questions around that, we're also happy to answer any questions if that would be helpful. With that, I am gonna hand over to Mang Pin, who's gonna dive specifically deeper into the commitments module and gonna show you some insights and gonna tell you how to explore more. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes, and hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mang Pin, and I'm associate with the Global Climate Program here at the World Resources Institute. And in this part of the webinar, I will be presenting the key modules of ClimateWatch and how you can use those online tools and resources for tracking, assessing, analyzing, and better understanding of the latest national climate commitments. And the module that we will be going through today is the commitment section of ClimateWatch. So next slide, please. Many of the visuals I will be showing today are direct screenshots from the ClimateWatch website. Please do know that all the information presented can be accessed through the URLs that will be listed on the bottom of the slides, and also, of course, at climatewatchdata.org if you want to go directly as well. And so let's dive right in. The Paris Agreement really aims to limit the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to further limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And one of the first steps countries are taking towards meeting the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement is to adopt individual contributions towards mitigation and adaptation outcomes. And those commitments need to be strengthened over time. So the overview page of the commitments module of ClimateWatch offers a snapshot of different aspects of countries' climate commitments. Reflecting back to the Menti pool results, we see clear interest in net zero targets, the new 2030 targets, and implementation policies. And we do cover the first two in this commitments overview section. And the implementation policies, we will get to them a little later when we get into the actual modules. So based on the UN Treaties collection page of the Paris Agreement, 189 parties have ratified the Paris Agreement since it entered into force in 2015. And those countries are the parties to the Paris Agreement. And they are required to outline their post-2020 climate actions, and also known as nationally determined contributions. As of yesterday, 188 parties have submitted their first NDCs. 5 countries have submitted their second NDCs, and those include 20 countries who have submitted their new and updated NDCs this year. And in addition to NDCs, countries are also invited to communicate their mid-century, long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, and also known as long-term strategies. And NDCs and LTS really embody countries' intended efforts to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to achieve the Paris temperature goals. Achieving the goals also requires increased ambition of NDCs over time, and countries are requested to submit new or updated NDC every 5 years. And this is the cycle of ambition that David was just talking about. And this year so far, we have seen 20 parties that have submitted their updated first NDCs or second NDCs. And over 100 parties have also stated their intentions of doing so. And we will look at all of those information in greater detail in the different tools and trackers in just a second. Aside from the commitments made through NDCs and long-term strategies, parties have also been discussing and adopting net zero emission targets, and which is clear interest from the audience. And additionally, countries have also enacted national climate policies and laws, and 62 of those incorporate economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction targets. So while those targets are not official submissions to the Paris Agreement, they do represent countries' domestic climate actions that might be reflected and aligned in their international climate commitments. And now let's move on to the actual trackers. So the first one is, of course, the 2020 NDC tracker that we launched end of last year. And this tool keeps track of countries' intention to update and enhance their next round of NDCs in 2020 and in the lead up to COP26. As mentioned already, so far this year, we have only seen 20 countries that have submitted a 2020 NDC. And of course, due to impact of COVID this year, many countries are facing possible delays of submitting their updated NDCs. And the number we have here, 126 countries, which includes the 27 EU member countries that have stated intention to submit their enhanced NDCs, does not necessarily reflect those delays. And our plan is to continue keeping this tracker alive and updated over the course of next year towards COP26. So I highly recommend that you bookmark this page, as this is usually one of the first pages that gets updated on Climate Watch by our analytical team when new NDC submissions comes in. And you can always come back to this page to find out about the latest submissions and which countries might submit next. And onto the table view of the 2020 NDC tracker that comes with the tracker. You can sort information by, for example, countries' share of global emissions, the submission date, the status of intention or submission, and you can also search the information with keywords. Towards end of this year, as David was just mentioning, we are still expecting many new submissions before and around the December 12th summit, this coming weekend and throughout end of 2020. And this includes really some of the biggest emitters, for example, China and European Union, showing here, and both of which had recently stated intention to submit enhanced NDCs. So please stay tuned. Next one, thanks, is really the updated and powerful tool for exploring countries' nationally determined contributions at much greater details. And this is where you might want to look for in-depth information of what is being communicated in countries' NDCs and how rigorous the NDCs are. The landing view of the Explore NDC module has been redesigned this year to come with the summary statistics and visualizations for a quick understanding of the latest emissions made by countries. And this include visualizations and numbers on, for example, how many parties falls under the different categories, of the particular indicator that's presented on the map, as well as the donut chart, which gives you the percentage of global emissions represented by the parties under those categories. And I do want to flag that the map view reflects the latest emission of each country. So this meaning the information mapped here is really a mix of the second NDCs, first NDCs, and even INDCs for certain countries, if that is indeed the latest emission that the country had made. And the next slide, thanks. And this one is really to give you a flavor of the 7 categories and the 40 indicators that you can choose from. And this ranges from what is the latest emission made by the country, which is the landing view and the past slide, and the breakdown of types of greenhouse gas target included in the latest NDCs, conditionality of the emissions, finance and support indicators, and sectoral adaptation and mitigation measures, and which sectors are covered. And we also include indicator regarding the UNFCCC processes, and particularly the ratification status of the Paris Agreement, which echoes the information that we have on the overview page we just looked at. And next slide, please. And this is a particular category that I'd like to give a special mention to, and this is the comparison to the previous NDC category. And here, we assess and compare the latest submission with the previous version under 5 different criteria. And namely, does the NDC include more a strengthened or new GHG target, strengthened or new sectoral targets, policies and actions, and additional adaptation commitments, and more broadly, whether it provides additional information for clarity, transparency, and understanding. And in addition to those, of course, if the new submission is indeed revised from the previous submission. And when we're at this view, this is of course also the table view underneath the landing summary map, and it will always show you the detailed information from the selected indicator from the drop-down menus. And again, of course, you can sort information by submission date, which I found quite handy for knowing information from the latest submissions, and filter information by, for example, keywords, or search for countries if you don't want to bother zooming in and out of the map. If you click on any of the country names on the table, or click on a country on the map, you will be guided to the NDC country pages, which is the next slide. And for those of you who are more in the weeds and who are interested to learn more about NDC submitted by countries, and not just the latest version, but also previous submissions, this is where you want to find the information. So essentially, the Explore NDCs module is powered by an underlying database of all the submissions analyzed and structured with over 250 indicators. And the analysis has been done for all the 165 INDCs communicated by parties between 2015 and 2017, the 188 first NDCs and the 5 second NDCs that have been submitted by countries and recorded in the NDC registry maintained by the Secretariat, and this including both the archived and updated versions of the first NDCs. And in this view, you can browse the information really in many different ways. The drop-down menu circled here is, of course, in the red box, is where you can browse and choose from the analysis of the previous submissions. So in the case of New Zealand here, we have its INDCs, which later turned into the first NDC, as well as the updated first NDC submitted earlier this year. And you can also switch between the countries very easily. And the information here is organized under different topics of mitigation, adaptation, and sectoral information, in addition to the summary and overview sections. And I guess last to mention on the NDC part, we do see our list of indicators and analysis, a living document, as Johannes mentioned. We strive to keep our analysis up to date, but we do welcome your feedback to improve our analysis and the indicator list. So next one on the long-term strategies. So as we were just mentioning when we look at the overview of commitments, in addition to NDCs, countries are also invited to communicate the so-called mid-century long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies under the Paris Agreement. And this Explore LTS module really keeps track of those long-term strategies that countries have been communicating to the UNFCCC. And this tool builds on a lot of the existing work of the long-term strategies tracker that we put online last year. And it comes with an expanded list of 50 indicators that we analyzed for each of the 20 NDCs that have been submitted so far. Majority of those indicators can be visualized on the map with the categories for easier access with summary statistics. For example, we don't have screenshots here, but for example, 19 parties included a quantified long-term emissions goal in their long-term strategies, and 7 of those are net zero targets, for those of you who are interested. From the discussions that we have been having, we know that many countries are still working on their long-term strategies and NDCs to be submitted towards the end of this year, and we will continue to monitor submissions and keep our trackers updated, and I also really encourage you to stay tuned to our different modules. And lastly, a very key and core feature that, next slide please. Thank you. A key and very essential feature that we are able to offer through Climate Watch this year, and that really completes the picture of the different commitments submitted by countries, is to compare all targets functionality. And this is a very powerful tool that put all the pieces together on Climate Watch. So this is the landing view of the compare all functionality, and it gives you a high-level overview of the existence of climate commitments from the countries. And this goes beyond the NDCs and the long-term strategies we just introduced. So the options to choose from also includes, for example, countries pre-2020 pledges. We are at 2020 now, but we still see those targets still relevant, and we incorporated the quantified economy-wide emission targets from developed countries and Europe and the NAMAs, the nationally appropriate mitigation actions from developing countries. And in addition to the commitments under the UNFCCC, this page also incorporates the economy-wide and sectoral climate targets from countries' national laws and policies. And from this page, users, or the page enables you to select and compare up to 3 documents from any of the existing submissions across countries. So you can compare essentially, for example, targets across different submissions and law documents for one country and see how the medium-term and long-term climate commitments are aligned or maybe not aligned, as well as, for example, comparing different versions of NDC submissions over time to get a sense of enhancement or changes of ambition over time. In addition, of course, you can compare NDCs across different countries and, for example, compare submission with neighboring countries and see where ambitions might be lacking, et cetera, et cetera. So this functionality is really offered with the intention that this would be a starting point of tracking and comparing countries' commitments over time and building understanding across countries. So next slide, please. So what is next in our agenda? In terms of development, another tool that we do want to roll out before end of this year and hopefully within the next week is the net zero tracker. With the limited climate budget that we have left, and we can clearly see from the emission gap report, the gap we're having, it is essential that countries are reducing emissions or the global emissions by half during the next decade or so. And we need to reach net zero early in the second half of the century. And many countries have adopted net zero targets or have those targets under discussion. So we have been working on the net zero tracker in collaboration with the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. And this also builds on the new paper of designing and communicating net zero targets, which is another great knowledge product recently published by WRI. So including the Brazil from its updated NDC yesterday, 24 countries plus the European Union, or 25 parties representing 40 countries, have adopted a net zero target. And those countries represent around 14% of global emissions. And this tracker keeps tabs of the net zero targets that have already been adopted in countries' legislations and policy documents. By saying this doesn't include the political statement, for example, or the targets that are under discussion. For example, the ones from China and from US that David just mentioned. And then, of course, we will continue keeping this tracker updated together with our long-term strategies team and ECIU, especially with the new NDCs and long-term strategies that are being submitted. And I do want to note that our partner from ECIU also do keep track of political statements and targets that are under discussion in their net zero tracker. And it also includes necessary targets from non-state actors, for example, provinces, states, and cities and companies. So feel free to check them out. And next slide, please. So to quickly summarize what we just covered, under the commitments module of Climate Watch, we really do offer quite a few resources to look at depending on your needs and what you're looking for. To recap again, the 2020 NDC tracker is where you would want to look at if you want to look for intentions of what submissions are being made, what are the latest submissions by countries, the intentions, and what countries might submit. And this is the next. And this is, again, one of the first pages that usually gets updated on Climate Watch when new NDCs comes in. The Explore NDCs module that comes with the map view, which is a landing page and includes a summary of latest submissions across the parties of UNFCCC. And of course, the NDC country pages where you might want to look at if you want to browse all the previous submissions in addition to the latest ones. And if you want to look deeper into the very comprehensive list of indicators that we have put forward. And we also have the Explore long-term strategies model that similarly comes with the map landing view and the country pages for summary view and detailed ability to browse the detailed indicators. The upcoming net zero tracker for net zero targets that have already been adopted in countries' legislation and policy documents. The compare all targets functionality, which is this powerful tool with the landing table view, where you can choose from and compare targets across different submissions and policy documents. And of course, the overview page of climate commitments if really all you need is a really quick number. And this is, of course, also an entry point to some of the trackers that we have mentioned above. And so next slide, please. So thank you. So the key focus of today has really been the commitments module, but I do want to mention some of the additional resources that we have to offer on Climate Watch that Johannes just mentioned. One is, of course, the country profile page. We are at the moment working on improving the country profile pages with curated information by topics. So for example, emission profiles, the emission targets, that is already in the country profile pages, the driver of emissions, the summary of countries' commitments and how they compare over time. So that would include not just NDCs and long-term strategies, but potentially also net zero targets, resilience and vulnerability profiles, and many more. And in terms of data offering and upcoming updates, in addition to the upcoming NDC and LTS submissions that will towards the December 12th moment and end of this year. And as Johannes just alluded to, we're also in the process of updating our flagship data set, which is the key country level historical greenhouse gas emissions inventory data. And the new update will include preliminary numbers up to 2018. In addition to this, we also made available through Climate Watch countries' official national inventories submitted to the UNFCCC, as well as great resources made available by the PIC emissions dataset and the global CO2 emissions from the Global Carbon Project. And before wrapping up, I do want to again mention that the key focus we have been putting effort on this year is engaging with and building the user community and I want to bring up the training opportunities that we have to offer that Johannes just mentioned. We have covered a lot today, but we didn't get a chance to go to the website for a real demonstration and walking through of our functionalities in greater detail. And we do hope that if you think your team or the partners you're working with might benefit from a training of Climate Watch, please reach out to us, and we would very love to have the conversation started and discuss the opportunities and options. This concludes my part of the webinar. Thank you so much for your attention, and we do hope that you find the tools and resources helpful for tracking and assessing countries' climate commitments. And with this, I will turn it over to my colleague, Matt.
Great. Thank you so much, Mengpin. So we're briefly going to just touch on visualizations, and then we'll jump into the question and answer session of the presentation. So as you can see here on the screen, these are some of the most popular Climate Watch visualizations that we've created from data on Climate Watch. These visualizations are typically embedded in WRI blog posts and provide deeper insights into the emissions and commitments that we've been discussing today. So if you're interested in reading more about what we've discussed today and digging deeper into some of the materials we have, our blog posts are linked on our homepage on Climate Watch. So I do encourage you to check those out, and we'll be sending around a link later with those blog posts. But Climate Watch will soon be publishing a visualization library on the site. So all of these visualizations can be found, accessed, and embedded from our site in one place. So if you're interested in exploring more, please stay tuned for our library. And if you're interested in creating a specific visualization for your own work or for social media, our team can offer guidance. And so I do encourage you to reach out to us, and we can hopefully help you out in creating visualizations. With that, I'm going to ask my colleague Leo to go to the next slide. And we will begin our question and answer session of the presentation. And I do want to note that we received a lot of great questions from our audience members during the registration process. So we'll begin with these questions, but please feel free to submit questions into the Q&A box on the Zoom taskbar, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. So let's begin. The first question is for David, and this comes from one of our attendees. How does one quantify countries' climate ambitions in terms of policies and targets? And is there a consistent way of doing this? And David, it looks like you're on mute if you're answering the question. Well, while we wait for David, we can jump to another question. So this one is for Mengpin. So does Climate Watch provide any insights in terms of the use of nature-based solutions for mitigation and adaptation?
Thanks for the question. I admittedly, well, I guess my quick answer is yes, if those are included in countries' NDCs. And I admittedly don't know top of my head which countries do have those information. However, there are indicators that covers the sectoral adaptation and mitigation measures that you can choose from to get those information. And another resource that we have offered on Climate Watch is a searchable database of the full text of countries' NDC submissions. And from there, you can really type in the keyword, for example, nature-based solutions, if that is your the topic that you're interested in, and see exactly how which NDCs, how many NDCs. So I hope that is helpful.
Great, thank you, Mengpin. And one of the modules we didn't go over today was our our sector module, which is featuring agriculture emissions. And one question we received is, and we get this question often, but Mungpin, are there plans to include any other sectors on Climate Watch in the near future?
Probably not in the near future, because of course you would understand the budget and capacity constraints. But looking forward, I think one of the two sectors we might be looking for is the power sector. And the reason being, Johannes was introducing in one of his slides, and those are the resources and platform that we have also been building within the WRI family of online data platforms, and the Power Explorer, and of course the Global Forest Watch. And we would have a lot more great information to show for these sectors, but we don't have firm plans at the moment to new sectoral profiles at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Mungpin. So David, if you're there, we'll start with this question again. How does one quantify a country's climate ambitions in terms of policies and targets? Is there a consistent way of doing this?
Well, it's a complicated answer. In terms of targets, there are several different ways in which countries put forward their targets, sometimes in absolute emissions terms, i.e. in terms of tons, sometimes though in terms of such metrics as what the emissions will be relative to business as usual trajectories. And then sometimes also through metrics such as intensity of carbon emissions relative to GDP. So sort of finding ways to make these comparable can be tricky, and then even more so with policies. So if you have a policy, for example, around a number of hectares of forest that you'll protect, or a number of hectares that you will restore forests, calculating these in GHG terms can be complicated. So it really does require looking carefully at, in fact, what a country has put forward, understanding the baselines that they're using, and so forth. And in part because of that, we do feel that over time, countries should move to absolute emissions reduction targets as a way to convey what it is that they're going to do. That said, I do think that NDCs have been very helpful in many cases in laying out very specific policies. And given the interest in implementation policies that we saw in the Menti poll at the top of the hour, I think including those and really reflecting not only what those top line targets are, but how countries are going to get there is quite critical.
Great, thank you. And another question for you, David. We've had a few questions about adaptation. And how do you measure adaptation targets set by governments? And do you have any examples of governments that have set really ambitious adaptation targets thus far?
There are, it's a good question. I would probably defer in some ways to our colleagues in the climate resilience practice at WRI. Adaptation action can be conveyed in a number of different ways, just as with mitigation, but even more so, I think. There are a number of countries that have put forward actions around how they will deal with water use, for example, countries that have addressed how they will deal with coastal protection, and so forth. I think some of the most interesting targets overlap mitigation and adaptation. For example, Mexico's first NDC indicated that its forest protection policies were aimed both at a mitigation purpose and to provide the kind of adaptation benefits one gets from forests as a buffer against extreme weather events, as a way to improve soil water retention, et cetera. And so there are many ways these can be expressed, and sometimes quantitatively, sometimes not. And we'd be happy to get back to anyone with a sense of where we're seeing the strongest action. Certainly there are countries that are leading the way on this.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is for Johannes and Mung Pin. Do you track climate neutrality commitments by cities and or regions on Climate Watch?
Yeah, I typed the question, sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, on Climate Watch, do we track climate neutrality commitments by cities or regions?
Yep, it's quite relevant to another question that I just answered in text. But one thing I do want to mention, which I forgot to do so in my presentation, is the scope of Climate Watch and the commitments module, the net zero tracker, and also even the emissions section on Climate Watch. The scope is really at the national level. And the scope of countries we are looking at is essentially the 197 parties of the UNFCCC. So quick answer is we don't include net zero targets that are beyond the scope of national level, but we do encourage you to check our partner's website, the ECIU Net Zero Tracker, and they do have information at, for example, cities, companies, and other non-state levels.
All right, excuse me, thank you. And we have another Climate Watch question. Are there plans to translate the Climate Watch site in the near future to other languages?
Yeah, this is Johannes. I can quickly answer this, which also connects to the previous questions regarding like any national information that we might have. We had considered doing translations since this is quite complicated to expand like this. We have decided not to do translations. You should be able to use Google Translate, for example, service like Google Translate, to do basic translations. We do, however, have country platforms, which I should mention. If you go on Climate Watch and countries, you will see that there's 3 country platforms that we have deployed, including South Africa, India, and Indonesia. The Indonesia one particularly is published in 2 languages. So there's some subnational information we're providing, as well as if you're interested, because the question was quite a bit in this in the Q&A. We do provide some insights. While most of our data is on the national level and national climate commitments, we provide some insights that can help you subnationally. Examples being with our country platforms. We do have some subnational emission inventories, including Indonesia's provinces emissions, as well as we will soon publish an updated version of the US state emissions, which we already also aim to make available through Climate Watch. As well as there is a direct function, for example, of NDC search, which you can actually search through all of the hundreds of documents that countries have submitted around their climate submission. So if you're interested, for example, which countries are referring to like urban development or cities in their NDCs, you can do that search. Even though we don't track like the commitments of cities, you can see how the national commitments might, for example, refer to any subnational targets. But I've also put in one of the answers some links to the Global Climate Action Portal from UNFCCC and the ECIU Net Zero Tracker that actually track more of the subnational commitments, which are our partners.
All right, great, thank you, Johannes. And it looks like we have time for one more question. And this one is kind of open to the team. It's one that I don't know the answer to. What Earth science satellite-based data and information is being used for NDCs now, if at all, and what more could be used?
That is a good question. I can answer this. The one thing to understand, there's obviously a lot of different perspectives around like what you include in climate action, both mitigation, adaptation, and finance, for example. when it comes to mitigation, particular, for example, tracking emissions and understanding emissions, those are usually developed through national statistics, who are more activity-based, so they often don't use this type of satellite imagery directly. There are specific sectors where satellite imagery can, for example, be more relevant, particularly around forests. So this is why we, for example, have the Global Forest Watch website, which tracks forest alerts, forest loss alerts on a weekly basis, 10-meter resolutions, which is very relevant to mitigation as well as adaptation. So there has been some work, and then particular in the adaptation field, the satellite imagery can really help to understand, for example, hazards of exposure and vulnerability. That is much more geospatial, which satellites can help. What I know this questions often go to, and I'm not sure if that was the intention, was if we can actually measure greenhouse gas emissions from space, for example. There's been several efforts that are being started. We are definitely not there yet, and you will see this in Climate Watch. The data that we actually publish around emissions does not come directly from satellite, it comes from national statistics. There are several efforts going on, some in which we are involved in, to see if, for example, there can be independent validation of power sector emissions, for example, from power plants, or national level emissions on a total territorial sense from space. So we can actually independently validate if what countries are reporting around their activities and their emission is actually correct. But that's future activity that is currently not available or not possible yet. But we're looking in the future that specifically with new satellites, that things like this become possible.
All right, very interesting. Thank you, Johannes. Well, that concludes our presentation today. Thank you all for attending and asking all these great questions. We will be posting a recording on the event page at some point later today. So if you know folks within your network who weren't able to attend, we do encourage you to share that recording with them. And as we've been mentioning throughout, if you're interested in having a training on Climate Watch for your organization or a group of folks, we are happy to offer that. You can reach out to us on our website. You can reach out to me. My email's on the screen here, or my colleague Leo. His information is in the chat. And we're happy to connect with you and set something up. We also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and email updates, and do share our content on social media using the Climate Watch hashtag and tagging WRI Climate. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.